Hey guys, tonight we dive into the world of one of Mexico's most notorious cartel bosses, a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of millions. His rise to power was not marked by noble beginnings, but by ruthlessness and the iron grip of violence. Picture yourself walking down the dark, narrow streets of a forgotten corner in Mexico, the faint sound of sirens in the distance, a reminder of a dangerous world lurking around every corner. The cartel boss we're talking about today didn't just climb to the top of the criminal underworld. He owned it, shaping an empire built on fear, corruption, and blood. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I've got a lot more stories just like this one to share, so hit that bell if you want to keep hearing the truth behind the headlines. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've probably heard the name or seen it in the news. This cartel boss started with nothing, but soon he was feared across nations. His name, Carlos Reyes, the infamous kingpin who rose from the poverty-stricken streets of a small Mexican town to become the leader of one of the most powerful cartels in the world. Carlos wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He came from humble beginnings, the son of farm workers who struggled to make ends meet. But Carlos had a different vision for his life, one far removed from the dusty fields where he grew up. His rise to power was swift. With a combination of charisma, violence, and cunning, he quickly gained the trust of the most dangerous criminals in the country. By the early 2000s, Carlos had established control over the drug trade that spanned borders and continents, using Mexico as a gateway for narcotics headed into the United States. But here's the twist. Carlos didn't just rely on traditional methods to expand his influence. He understood the intricacies of law, politics, and public perception. He made connections in high places, quietly infiltrating Mexico's political landscape. The cartel, under his leadership, became untouchable. Every corner of the country felt the weight of his power. It's this rise from nothing to unimaginable power that makes Carlos Reyes such a chilling figure. And it's his story that we're going to follow, step by step, tonight. As Carlos Reyes' influence grew, so did his cartel's operations. At first, it was just small-time drug trafficking, smuggling marijuana and cocaine across the border, using the same routes that countless others had used before him. But what set Carlos apart wasn't just his violent nature. It was his ability to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. He understood the power of supply and demand, and he knew how to exploit it like few others. By the early 2000s, Carlos' cartel had grown into a well-oiled machine. His network extended from the farthest reaches of Mexico's rural mountains to the heart of the United States. It wasn't just drugs now. He was controlling everything from weapons to human trafficking. And the most terrifying part? He did it all with a careful hand, keeping everything hidden in plain sight, operating in the shadows of politics, police, and public life. You can imagine the kind of empire Carlos built, one where millions of dollars flowed in daily, and the leaders of the cartel were untouchable. He used fear to keep his rivals in check, and used charm to win over his allies. The amount of money at his disposal meant he could buy anything: people, politicians, even law enforcement officials. It was said that Carlos' cartel had more cash than some small countries. His wealth gave him access to all the resources he needed to maintain control. But there was one thing Carlos understood better than most. In the criminal world, power was not just about wealth, it was about fear. By the mid-2000s, Carlos had orchestrated a series of brutal takeovers in the cartels of Mexico. He took down anyone who stood in his way with a ruthlessness that became legendary. If a rival cartel boss refused to bend, Carlos didn't hesitate to make an example of them. His cartel operated like a shadow government. There were no lines they wouldn't cross, no deal they wouldn't make, and no punishment too severe for betrayal. The power he wielded, however, wasn't just confined to the drugs and weapons trade. Carlos Reyes was becoming something much more dangerous, a kingmaker. Politicians, judges, law enforcement officials, and even businessmen found themselves indebted to him in ways they couldn't escape. His influence was now everywhere. Legitimate businesses, government offices, even schools and hospitals were under his sway. He wasn't just a drug lord anymore. Carlos Reyes had become a figure of myth and legend, and no one was brave enough to challenge him. Carlos Reyes wasn't just feared for his ability to crush his enemies. He was revered for his ability to maintain control over an empire that stretched across borders, infiltrated governments, and corrupted entire systems. Under his rule, the cartel had grown into something beyond just a criminal organization. It was a state within a state. Mexico was his kingdom, and he ruled it with the cold, calculated precision of a chess master. But the true extent of his power didn't just come from his wealth or his network. It came from the violence he so carefully orchestrated. Carlos didn't just send a message when he wanted something done. He made sure the world heard it. His methods were ruthless, and the executions that followed were public spectacles meant to serve as a warning to anyone who might even think about defying him. Bodies were found in the streets of major cities, dumped in public places for all to see. Heads left on stakes, messages written in blood. His enemies were made examples of, and his allies were reminded that loyalty meant everything. Betrayal, however, meant death. But for all his cruelty, there was a method to Carlos's madness. He didn't believe in indiscriminate killing. His murders were strategic, calculated. There was always a reason. Whether it was eliminating a rival, sending a message to an uncooperative politician, or sending a chilling reminder to his underlings, each act of violence was carefully planned, executed with precision. Carlos' cartel had infiltrated not just the political system, but also the police forces across Mexico. Through bribery, intimidation, and threats, he made sure that law enforcement was either directly under his control or too terrified to challenge him. Police officers who might have thought about crossing him disappeared without a trace. Judges who were brave enough to rule against his cartel found their homes torched in the middle of the night. No one was above his reach. The law became a tool in his hands, bent to serve his will. Despite the growing power of his cartel, Carlos wasn't just interested in money or territory. He craved recognition, power, and control. He wanted his name etched into the history of Mexico, wanted to be remembered as a man who had shaped the course of his country. He envisioned himself as the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the curtain, with the country unknowingly dancing to his tune. But as much as Carlos thought himself untouchable, there were cracks beginning to show. The more power he accumulated, the more enemies he made, some inside his own cartel, some among the elite who found themselves beholden to his influence. In the halls of power, there were whispers. People were starting to notice that Carlos wasn't just another drug lord. He was a player on a much larger stage. And as Carlos expanded his empire, he began to make one critical mistake. He became too confident, too assured that no one could ever stop him. The cost of his actions was starting to catch up with him, and it wouldn't be long before those who wanted him gone would find a way to turn the tables. The walls were closing in, and though Carlos still held the reins of power, forces were aligning against him, forces he had underestimated. By the time law enforcement finally began to close in on Carlos, he had already solidified his position as one of the most dangerous men in the world. But even the most powerful figures, no matter how insulated they feel, can't avoid the inevitable. It started with whispers, rumors of an undercover operation that was gaining traction. At first, Carlos dismissed it as a fleeting concern, a passing annoyance. He had been untouchable for so long that the idea of someone actually taking him down seemed almost laughable. But soon, those whispers began to grow louder. Law enforcement agencies from around the world had quietly banded together, knowing they needed to take Carlos down before his influence spread even further. Mexico, the United States, and several other countries with ties to Carlos's operations now found themselves reluctantly working as a team. It was no longer about tracking drug shipments. This was about dismantling an empire. Undercover agents had infiltrated the cartel at multiple levels. Some posed as members of rival gangs. Others embedded themselves in the political circles that Carlos had bought and corrupted. The most dangerous asset, however, came from an unlikely source. A former trusted associate who had once worked alongside Carlos, a man who knew the inner workings of the cartel like no one else. This informant, known only by his code name El Lobo, became the crucial linchpin in the investigation that would eventually bring Carlos Reyes down. El Lobo had been with Carlos from the very beginning, helping to orchestrate his rise to power. He had witnessed the cartel's transformation from a small-time drug operation to a massive criminal empire. But over time, El Lobo had grown disillusioned by the cartel's ruthless methods and by Carlos's increasingly erratic behavior. The violence, the betrayals, and the lives lost weighed heavily on him. He had come to realize that Carlos was no longer the man he had once admired. So, he made a choice that would forever change the course of his life. El Lobo made contact with law enforcement, offering them vital information in exchange for protection and immunity. He was the perfect mole. Inside the cartel, able to move undetected, able to feed crucial information about Carlos's operations and hideouts. And that's when the real work began. Undercover agents slowly began to piece together the vast, intricate web of Carlos's empire. They tracked shipments, monitored communication lines, and slowly chipped away at the cartel's network. It was like hunting a ghost. Carlos was careful, always staying 2 steps ahead. But what he didn't account for was El Lobo. The former trusted lieutenant knew his every move, every hideout, every secure location. For months, law enforcement worked tirelessly, gathering evidence that would tie Carlos to the most heinous crimes imaginable. Not just drug trafficking and murder, but human trafficking, money laundering, and even terrorism. The deeper they dug, the more horrifying the revelations became. Carlos wasn't just a drug lord. He was a kingpin with his fingers in everything from government corruption to international arms smuggling. He had created a criminal empire that extended across multiple continents, and his reach seemed limitless. But as El Lobo fed law enforcement crucial details about Carlos's operations, they also began to realize something chilling. Carlos wasn't just a man, they were facing a system, a network that was so deeply entrenched in both Mexico's criminal and political spheres that taking him down would require not just arresting one man, but dismantling an entire structure of corruption. They weren't just hunting Carlos anymore. They were hunting a system, and the closer they got to Carlos, the more dangerous it became. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement began to realize the true scale of the cartel's reach. It wasn't just about cracking down on drug trafficking or arms smuggling anymore. It was about cutting off the very lifeblood of the criminal organization, money. Carlos's cartel was so well structured that even their financial operations had their own secret channels. hidden behind legitimate businesses, government contracts, and fake charities. It was a web of deceit, where each strand connected to someone powerful. The operation to take down Carlos was unlike anything law enforcement had ever attempted. It was a slow, patient game of cat and mouse. Every time they thought they were closing in on him, Carlos would slip away, disappearing into the shadows. The cartel's network had been built to be self-sustaining, with layers of corruption at every level, and Carlos's intelligence was unmatched. He was always aware of who was after him, always making sure his actions were one step ahead of the law. Yet, El Lobo's information was invaluable. The mole knew that Carlos wasn't just hiding in Mexico. He had connections in the United States, Central America, and even parts of Europe. His influence was far-reaching, and law enforcement had to account for this sprawling network in their efforts. To make a significant impact, they needed to strike at the core, the heart of Carlos's empire. But finding that heart would be no easy feat. Months passed, and with each new piece of intelligence that came in, the law enforcement teams drew closer to Carlos's inner circle. They had uncovered hideouts, safe houses, and even discovered a few of his key lieutenants. But Carlos was always just out of reach. It became clear to them that they needed a plan that wasn't just about arresting him. It was about disrupting the entire system he had built. Every asset had to be neutralized, every connection severed. Then, finally, an opportunity arose, one that Carlos never saw coming. El Lobo provided information that led to the discovery of one of Carlos's most critical assets, a sprawling warehouse located just outside of Mexico City. The warehouse wasn't just a storage facility. It was a hub for distributing everything the cartel needed, from drugs and weapons to human trafficked victims and money laundering operations. It was the center of the cartel's logistical infrastructure, and Carlos, it seemed, had made the mistake of thinking it was secure. The law enforcement team, now working in unison with military units and international partners, devised an operation that was as daring as it was risky. They decided to strike the warehouse with a full-scale assault, knowing that it was their best shot at disrupting the cartel's flow of goods and information. This wasn't just about catching Carlos. It was about crippling the very network that allowed him to operate with impunity. At the same time, a plan to apprehend Carlos was in motion. Agents had tracked him to a safe house in the mountains, one that he frequented for short, covert stays. For once, they had caught him unawares, and the time for caution was over. The two operations were scheduled for the same night. In the dead of the night, as the moon hung in a dark sky over Mexico, law enforcement moved in. The warehouse was raided, and El Lobo's intel proved to be right. Inside, they found not just a trove of narcotics, but the cartel's finances in hard copies, dossiers on politicians and businessmen who had been bought, and a trove of recorded conversations that proved the depth of Carlos's connections. They found weapons caches that spanned the entire continent, and even more disturbingly, they discovered a warehouse dedicated to human trafficking operations, women and children locked away like commodities. The cartel's empire, once so well hidden, was slowly coming apart. The world began to see the scope of Carlos's crimes. The arrest of the warehouse's guards and some of his closest lieutenants shook the foundation of the cartel. But even as they raided the warehouse, Carlos was still in motion, on the move with his last remaining loyalists. The clock was ticking. Carlos knew the game was up, and he didn't plan to be taken alive. But law enforcement was closing in fast. The most dangerous part of this operation was about to unfold. As Carlos realized that his empire was on the brink of collapse, the quiet arrogance that had once defined him began to unravel. He was no longer the untouchable kingpin. He was a man on the run, desperately trying to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. But Carlos wasn't just a criminal, he was a strategist. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to disappear into the shadows when things got too hot. And as the authorities raided his warehouse, he slipped away, using a network of safe houses that had been prepared for moments like this. His escape was the beginning of a deadly game of cat and mouse that would see Carlos and law enforcement locked in a deadly standoff. Carlos was cornered, but he wasn't giving up without a fight. The night of the warehouse raid marked a turning point. The evidence collected from the operation gave law enforcement a clear picture of the cartel's operations, but Carlos was still very much a threat. He had learned to move fast, leave no trace, and make sure that every exit was covered. He knew that law enforcement would be closing in soon, and he had one last trick up his sleeve. His plan was clear: lay low, hit the authorities where it hurt, and wait for the heat to die down before resurfacing. But law enforcement wasn't as naive as Carlos hoped. The International Task Force, led by the DEA and Mexican military, had been waiting for this moment. They had been gathering intel from various undercover operatives, and they knew that Carlos would need to resurface eventually. It was only a matter of time. As Carlos fled deeper into the rugged mountains of Mexico, he thought of his options. He had already abandoned his luxurious homes, the lavish mansions funded by the drug trade, and now he was hiding in the wilderness. For the first time, Carlos was out of his element. The luxury and comfort of his previous life felt far away. He was alone, and the only thing left to rely on was his survival instincts. Meanwhile, the law enforcement operation was far from over. A manhunt of unprecedented proportions had begun. The task force had launched a full-scale search for Carlos, setting up roadblocks, using helicopters to cover vast stretches of wilderness, and working closely with local informants who might have insight into Carlos' next move. But this wasn't a simple operation. Carlos knew the terrain like the back of his hand, and he wasn't going down without a fight. As the manhunt continued, tensions within Carlos' remaining lieutenants began to rise. The heat was on, and those closest to him started to question their loyalty. Would they go down with Carlos, or would they turn on him to save themselves? The whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire through his network, and soon Carlos was not only fighting law enforcement, but also his own people. El Lobo, who had given law enforcement crucial intelligence, was now working with a growing number of agents who were set on bringing Carlos to justice. As Carlos' last trusted allies began to crumble under the pressure, it became clear that he was running out of options. But Carlos wasn't going to surrender. He was a man who had built his empire on brutality and cunning, and he wouldn't let it slip away without a fight. The hunt continued for days, but with each passing hour, Carlos' situation became more desperate. His allies had deserted him, and the law enforcement agencies had drawn a tight circle around him. Yet Carlos still had one thing left: his reputation. He wasn't going down quietly. His plan was simple: escape and fight another day. But as the net closed in, he realized that his days as a free man were numbered. Carlos, now alone and without the support of his former allies, retreated deeper into the mountains of Mexico. The terrain was unforgiving, and the once untouchable kingpin was now a fugitive, fighting for survival. His mind raced as he recalled the vast network of resources he had once commanded. How quickly it had all fallen apart. His luxurious homes, his fleet of cars, the power he had so effortlessly wielded, it was all gone. Now he had to rely on his wits and the survival skills he had honed as a young man before he had become the feared cartel boss. As Carlos trekked through the dense forests, moving from one hideout to the next, law enforcement was getting closer. The operation to capture him was no longer just about finding a fugitive. It was about sending a message to the criminal world. The Mexican authorities, with the support of international agencies like the DEA and Interpol, had pooled all of their resources to track him down. Carlos was now public enemy number one, and his escape only made his capture more urgent. But Carlos had always been a master at playing the long game. He knew he couldn't stay in one place for too long, so he moved constantly, shifting locations every few hours, covering his tracks meticulously. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand, and he was well versed in using the natural world to stay hidden. But this time it felt different. The walls were closing in, and no matter how much he had planned for moments like this, Carlos could feel the pressure mounting. Back in the city, law enforcement's search for Carlos intensified. They had a team of undercover agents, informants, and military personnel working around the clock. It was only a matter of time before they would find him. Every tip they received was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Carlos's desperation grew as he realized that even his most trusted contacts had turned on him. The tide was turning, and his once formidable empire was unraveling faster than he could control. Despite his many attempts to remain hidden, Carlos made a critical mistake. He underestimated the power of modern technology. While he had once been able to rely on the shadows, now surveillance technology, drones, and digital tracking were all working against him. As the manhunt progressed, authorities began to use satellite imagery and heat detection systems to narrow down his location. They knew he was moving, and they knew he couldn't keep up this cat-and-mouse game forever. Meanwhile, El Lobo, the former trusted lieutenant who had become the key informant, had been feeding law enforcement with detailed information about Carlos's movements. Every time Carlos shifted his position, El Lobo was one step ahead, guiding the authorities closer. In fact, it was El Lobo who provided the final piece of the puzzle, information that led to a location where Carlos had made his final stand, a remote farmhouse hidden deep in the mountains. It was here, at this dilapidated farmhouse, that Carlos would face the consequences of his reign. The house itself was surrounded by thick trees and rough terrain, perfect for a cartel boss who had spent years evading the law. But the authorities, now with El Lobo's intel, were closing in, their movements precise and coordinated. Carlos, however, wasn't prepared to be cornered. He had always been 2 steps ahead, but this time, the walls had closed in faster than he anticipated. With nowhere left to run, Carlos knew he had to make a choice: fight back or surrender. But surrender was never an option for Carlos Reyes. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the farmhouse, Carlos made his move. He grabbed his weapon, an old but reliable assault rifle, and prepared for the showdown. He had no intention of going down without a fight. For him, it was either escape or die trying. Meanwhile, the law enforcement team had surrounded the area. The operation was in full swing, with agents positioned around the farmhouse, waiting for the signal to close in. The tension was thick. They had come this far, and they knew Carlos wasn't going to make it easy. The moment arrived. Carlos fired the first shot. It was a warning, a challenge, a signal that he wasn't going to give up his empire without a fight. But law enforcement had prepared for this. They had the manpower, the strategy, and the resolve to see this through. The operation was swift and decisive. In the chaos that followed, Carlos fought fiercely, but the law was relentless. Shots rang out, and the once feared cartel boss was finally brought to the ground. It wasn't a glorious victory for law enforcement, but it was an end to the reign of one of the most notorious figures in the criminal world. As Carlos was handcuffed and dragged from the farmhouse, it felt like a final, inevitable conclusion to his story. He had built an empire, but in the end, it was his own hubris that had led to his downfall. The very methods that had made him so dangerous, his manipulation, his violence, his strategic mind, had ultimately been his undoing. The law had finally caught up with him. Carlos Reyes sat in the back of a heavily armored vehicle, his hands shackled to the seat. The once feared cartel boss, who had commanded the Mexican underworld with such ferocity, now looked a shadow of his former self. His eyes, which had once radiated power and control, were dimmed by defeat and exhaustion. His empire had crumbled, and the law enforcement officers who had spent years hunting him now had him in their custody. For Carlos, this moment was a bitter pill to swallow. The very life he had built, an empire of blood, money, and influence, was now reduced to rubble. His cartel, which had once stretched its influence across multiple countries, was dismantled piece by piece. The once loyal lieutenants had either been arrested or turned on him, the informants feeding law enforcement with every scrap of information that led them closer to his hideout. And even though Carlos had fought to the bitter end, there was no escaping his fate. As the vehicle made its way toward the detention facility, Carlos's thoughts lingered on the past. He had been untouchable for so long. The power he had amassed had allowed him to manipulate everything around him: politicians, police officers, even the very people who were supposed to protect the law. He had bribed, coerced, and killed to get what he wanted. And for a time, it had worked. He had become a ghost, an enigma that no one could touch. But the world had changed, and the long arm of justice had finally caught up with him. The moment he was placed into a holding cell, Carlos knew he was facing the consequences of his actions. He would stand trial for the atrocities he had committed: drug trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, and countless murders. His days of luxury were over. His name, once feared by all who crossed him, was now synonymous with defeat. But Carlos was no fool. Even as he sat in that cold, lonely cell, his mind raced. He had spent his life in the shadows, always thinking several moves ahead. He knew this wasn't the end. He still had connections, people who owed him favors. The law enforcement agencies that had worked tirelessly to bring him down had done their job. But Carlos was certain that there were still doors left open. The cartel, though weakened, was not gone. And the architect, the hidden mastermind behind his empire, was still at large, watching the events unfold from the shadows. As he stared at the cold cement walls of his cell, Carlos couldn't help but feel a certain admiration for the system that had caught him. The operation to bring him down had been methodical, precise, and relentless. El Lobo, his former ally turned informant, had been the key to his undoing. Carlos had trusted him, once, but he had underestimated how far his former lieutenant would go to protect his own life. Meanwhile, law enforcement was still piecing together the vast network Carlos had built. His downfall had been more than just a manhunt. It was a systemic collapse that would have far-reaching consequences. And as much as Carlos had controlled everything around him, the cracks in his empire had begun to show. He knew that in time, more arrests would follow. His closest associates would be exposed, and his cartel would be splintered beyond repair. Yet, the part of Carlos's mind that still clung to the idea of power refused to give in. The law may have caught him, but the game was far from over. He had been taken down once, but Carlos knew that his reach had extended far beyond the physical world. His network was still out there, still fighting to hold onto whatever power it had left. As the hours turned into days, Carlos's legal team began to prepare for the inevitable trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but Carlos was never one to simply accept his fate. He would fight, just as he had fought his way to the top. The courtroom would become his final battlefield, where he would attempt to retain his dignity and maybe even secure a lesser sentence. But no matter what happened in that courtroom, Carlos knew one thing for sure: his empire was gone, and no amount of money or influence would bring it back. But what truly gnawed at Carlos was the reality that his empire, his reign over Mexico, had been taken down not by law enforcement, but by betrayal. His own people had turned on him, fed information to the authorities, and destroyed everything he had spent years building. In his final moments, Carlos realized that trust, the very thing that had made him powerful, had also been his undoing. His closest allies had been his biggest liability. In the coming months, as Carlos prepared to stand trial, the full scope of his crimes was revealed. He had built an empire of terror, and the world was beginning to see the true cost of his rule. But for Carlos, the most bitter part of his downfall wasn't the money, the violence, or the empire. It was the fact that, in the end, it was his own men who had torn him apart from the inside. And as the trial loomed closer, the question remained: would justice be served, or would Carlos find a way to pull strings from behind bars? Would he fade into obscurity, forgotten by the world? Or would his name live on in the shadows as a symbol of power, corruption, and the fall of one of the most dangerous men in history? Carlos Reyes sat in his holding cell, a place far removed from the world he had once ruled. The cold concrete walls, the harsh fluorescent lights, and the silence of his isolation were a far cry from the grand mansions and lavish hotels he had once frequented. His empire was shattered, his name dragged through the mud, and his future uncertain. But even in this dark place, Carlos refused to break. His mind, ever sharp and calculating, began to work, plotting his next move. The legal battle was about to begin, and the charges stacked against him were nothing short of staggering. The world had already heard the details of his cartel's operations, the sheer scale of his criminal enterprise. Drug trafficking, human smuggling, money laundering, murder. The list went on. But as his lawyers prepared his defense, Carlos's thoughts turned to a more personal matter: the betrayal that had led to his downfall. El Lobo, the once trusted lieutenant, had provided law enforcement with everything they needed to track Carlos down. He had been the key to breaking open Carlos's network. Carlos could feel the sting of betrayal deep within him, and though he had maintained a cold exterior in front of his captors, his mind was consumed with thoughts of revenge. He had spent years creating alliances, making sure that his empire was protected from both outsiders and insiders. But no amount of power could shield him from the treachery of those closest to him. And it wasn't just El Lobo. The web of corruption Carlos had spun stretched far beyond his cartel. Politicians, businessmen, even members of law enforcement had been in his pocket. They were the ones who had allowed his empire to flourish for so long, turning a blind eye to his operations in exchange for money and favors. But now, with his fall from grace, the very system he had relied on was beginning to turn against him. Carlos had always been a step ahead of everyone else, but this time he had underestimated the very people who had helped him rise to power. The men who once owed him everything had now become his greatest threat. And the more he thought about it, the more Carlos realized that his downfall wasn't just about El Lobo's betrayal. It was about the collapse of the entire system he had created. He had relied on loyalty, on power, and on fear. But it wasn't enough. The day of his trial finally arrived, and Carlos found himself face to face with the consequences of his actions. As he was escorted into the courtroom, the eyes of the world were on him. Journalists, television cameras, and the public all gathered to witness the fall of the once feared kingpin. The courtroom was filled with a tension that was almost palpable, and Carlos could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had once been untouchable, a man who had controlled the criminal underworld with an iron fist. But now, he was just another defendant facing justice. The trial itself was a spectacle. The prosecution had an overwhelming case against him, with evidence from El Lobo and other informants, intercepted communications, and the testimony of cartel members who had been arrested and turned on Carlos. It seemed like every piece of evidence pointed directly to him. Yet, even as the charges piled up, Carlos maintained his composure. He sat quietly in the courtroom, his face impassive, as his lawyers fought to reduce his charges and secure a lighter sentence. It was in the midst of the trial that Carlos made his move. In a shocking twist, he attempted to buy his way out of the situation. Using his remaining contacts on the outside, Carlos tried to leverage the last bits of power he had left. He offered bribes to judges, lawyers, even politicians, hoping to sway the outcome of the trial in his favor. It was a desperate attempt, one that showed just how deeply embedded Carlos's corruption had become. But it was a move that would seal his fate. The authorities, aware of Carlos's previous manipulative tactics, had prepared for this. His attempts to influence the trial only served to further incriminate him. The more he tried to pull strings from behind the scenes, the more the public saw the true extent of his criminality. His once mighty empire had been built on lies, deceit, and manipulation, and now, those same tactics were being used against him. The trial went on for months, but the evidence was clear, and the verdict was inevitable. Carlos Reyes was found guilty on all charges: drug trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, and murder. The judge sentenced him to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. It was a crushing blow for the once untouchable kingpin, but it was also a moment of vindication for those who had worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. Carlos's conviction didn't just mark the end of his reign. It signified the beginning of the end for the cartel he had built. Law enforcement agencies around the world, emboldened by the trial's outcome, began to dismantle the network that Carlos had created. His closest allies were arrested, his assets seized, and his influence crumbled to dust. The once powerful empire was no more. But Carlos wasn't done. Even behind bars, he remained a dangerous figure. He still had connections, still had allies who believed in him. And though he would never regain the power he had once wielded, Carlos Reyes was a reminder of how quickly the mighty could fall. The cartel, once an unstoppable force, was now a shell of its former self. And as the years went by, Carlos became just another figure in the long line of criminal bosses who had been brought to justice. His story, a tale of ambition, violence, and betrayal, would be passed down through the generations as a warning of what happens when one man's thirst for power consumes everything around him. Carlos Reyes sat in his prison cell, the harsh concrete walls a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Once a kingpin, a man whose very name instilled fear in the hearts of politicians, law enforcement, and civilians alike, now reduced to nothing more than a number in the system. His life of luxury, his vast empire, and the power he had once held so effortlessly were now nothing but distant memories. He spent his days in solitude, reflecting on the empire he had built, the bloodshed that had fueled his rise, and the moment everything had come crashing down. Despite his confinement, Carlos's mind remained sharp. His lawyers, still loyal to him, worked tirelessly to try and secure an appeal. But deep down, Carlos knew that the battle had been lost. His legacy, once one of absolute power, had been completely shattered. The once feared cartel was crumbling without him at the helm, and his empire's disintegration was both a source of his frustration and his bitter acceptance. The world that had once bent to his will had now turned its back on him. Yet even in prison, Carlos had a strange sense of calm. The loss of everything he had once held dear had given him a kind of peace, one that came with the knowledge that he had done what he had set out to do. He had built something that lasted. Even if it was broken, even if it had been taken from him, his empire had once ruled the underworld. And now, in the shadow of his downfall, he was content to sit back and reflect on his place in history. Carlos had built an empire from nothing, and no one would ever forget it. But his life in prison wasn't without complications. Even behind bars, Carlos remained a valuable asset to those who had once worked for him. His cartel, though broken, still had loyalists who believed that Carlos's fall was temporary. Some saw him as a martyr, a symbol of resistance against the authorities that had brought him down. They still held on to the belief that Carlos could one day rise again, perhaps from the ashes of his destroyed empire. And as a result, his prison life became a delicate balancing act between safety and the potential for further betrayal. Carlos wasn't entirely alone in his cell. In fact, there were whispers, rumors of hidden contacts still trying to communicate with him, remnants of the network he had left behind. But these were dangerous games. Every conversation was monitored, every visitor scrutinized by authorities. Carlos had learned long ago that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and even in prison, those close to him could still be dangerous. A betrayal now, more than ever, could cost him his life. And the last thing Carlos wanted was to fall victim to the same game that had cost him everything. As months turned into years, Carlos began to lose his grip on his once immense power. His health started to decline. The stress of his trial, the weight of years in solitary confinement, and the lack of access to the luxury he had once enjoyed had taken their toll. He had become a prisoner not only of the system, but of his own past. Every day felt like a countdown, a race against time as his legacy began to fade. The outside world, however, continued to move on. Without Carlos at the helm, his cartel splintered, eventually being absorbed into rival factions. Some of his most trusted lieutenants had turned on him, some had been arrested, and others had been killed in the ongoing violence that followed his arrest. While Carlos remained behind bars, his empire continued to fracture, and those who once had sworn loyalty to him were now facing the consequences of their actions. But even as Carlos's once great empire collapsed around him, he couldn't help but feel that a part of him still had power. He had outlasted countless enemies, crossed borders, and manipulated governments. He had built something that many thought could never be destroyed. The destruction of his cartel, though inevitable, was a painful reminder of how quickly power could slip through your fingers. And as Carlos sat in his prison cell, those days of ruling from the shadows felt like a lifetime ago. But the world had changed, and so had Carlos. In the prison yard, as he looked out across the bleak landscape, he realized that his name, once feared by so many, would eventually fade into the annals of history. The authorities had won for now. But he knew the truth. History was full of men like him. Men who built empires, who sought to control everything, and who eventually faced their own downfall. And though Carlos would never be free again, his name would still echo through the criminal world, a symbol of what ambition and ruthlessness could achieve, and what they could destroy. Carlos Reyes had been brought to justice, but the ghosts of his empire would haunt the world for years to come. Carlos's trial had been a spectacle, and his conviction marked the end of an era. But as the years passed, his story began to fade from the front pages, replaced by newer headlines, newer criminals, and new threats. Yet, in the darker corners of the world, there were still whispers of his name. Even in prison, Carlos remained a figure of legend. His story, however tragic, was one that served as a reminder of the dangers of ambition and power. He had created something unstoppable, but it had come at a cost he had never fully anticipated. In the prison, Carlos was slowly forgotten by many, but the shadows of his past were never truly gone. Some still thought of him as a hero of sorts, a symbol of resistance against the systems that had torn down his empire. Others saw him as a martyr, someone who had been wronged by the very system he had once manipulated so easily. Carlos often wondered how history would remember him. Would he be seen as a villain, a ruthless drug lord whose empire left a trail of destruction in its wake? Or would the world, years down the line, remember him as a man who had fought for something bigger than himself? A man who had once ruled from the shadows, bringing with him a new order of power? As his body began to weaken in his old age, Carlos had nothing left but time. Time to reflect on his life, on the empire he had built and lost, and on the people who had helped him rise to power. Some of them were still in the wind, still working in the shadows, still doing the things they had always done. The vast network he had built might have crumbled, but it wasn't entirely gone. Carlos still had connections, people who would remember him and the legacy he left behind. Yet, Carlos's legacy was more complex than just the cartel he had ruled. It was the system he had created, a system built on fear, loyalty, and blood. Even though the cartel was broken, its influence still lingered. It had set the stage for new players to enter the game, men and women who saw the void Carlos left and decided to fill it with their own ambitions. His fall from grace had left a power vacuum, and as much as Carlos had tried to shape the world around him, the world was now shaping itself anew. The cartels were fractured, but the spirit of lawlessness, of ruthless ambition, remained. In prison, Carlos had come to understand the limits of his control. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, using manipulation and violence to shield himself from the outside world. But in the end, it wasn't the law, or even his enemies, that had taken him down. It was his own overconfidence. His inability to trust the very people who had once stood by him had been his undoing. His empire had crumbled from within, eaten away by betrayal and the very loyalty he had thought he could control. Carlos Reyes was now just another figure in the long line of fallen kings of crime. But in his final years, he remained convinced that his story was far from over. The legacy he left behind, the lessons learned from his rise and fall, would continue to reverberate through the criminal world. He may have lost everything, but the blueprint he had created, the empire he had built, was still alive in the world he had left behind. And though his body was frail, his mind remained sharp. Carlos began to hear rumors from other inmates about the continuing struggles in the world outside. The rise of new cartels, new leaders trying to fill the void he had left. The struggle for control of Mexico, of the drug trade, had never ceased. The battles had only shifted. In his isolation, Carlos found a strange sense of peace. He no longer sought power. He no longer desired to control anything. All he wanted was to be remembered. Carlos Reyes had once been a force of nature, but as he sat alone in his cell, an old man whose name was now etched in the annals of history, he realized the truth. His fall had been inevitable. It wasn't the law that had caught him, it was time. Power, wealth, fear. These things could only carry a person so far. In the end, even the mightiest empires fall. And Carlos knew deep down that his had fallen because he had pushed it too far. The final chapters of his life were filled with nothing but time. time for reflection, time for regrets, time for solitude. Carlos Reyes, the man who had once ruled with an iron fist, was now a shadow of the past, trapped in a prison of his own making. As he lay on his cot, staring at the cold metal bars above him, Carlos was forced to confront the question that had always lingered in the back of his mind. Was it all worth it? The money, the power, the fear, was it worth the ultimate cost? The cartel, once a symbol of his dominance, was now just a memory, and the men who had helped him build it were either gone or scattered. But despite the weight of his regrets, Carlos never once apologized for his actions. He had been a product of the system, a man who had seen opportunity in a world filled with corruption. And in the end, that system had taken him down. But even as the years passed and the world moved on, Carlos knew that his story would remain. A legend, a warning, and a reminder of what happens when ambition runs unchecked. As the years passed, Carlos Reyes's name remained a whispered legend in the dark corners of Mexico's underworld. Even behind the cold, sterile walls of his prison, the world outside never truly stopped moving. His empire may have fallen, but the void left in its wake was filled by new players, ambitious young men and women who learned from his methods and built their own networks of power. Some of them had once served Carlos and learned the ropes under his ruthless tutelage. They had witnessed firsthand how one man could carve his name into the history of an entire nation, and now, with Carlos out of the picture, they were hungry to take that mantle. In the quiet isolation of his cell, Carlos could hear the echoes of the world he once ruled. He would occasionally get snippets of news from fellow inmates, brief mentions of a cartel boss rising to power, or a war breaking out over drug trafficking routes. Sometimes a familiar name would surface, someone from his past who had either been captured, killed, or had become the subject of another police investigation. These were the ghosts of his empire, reminders of the empire that had once been. But Carlos, now a shell of the man he had once been, found it difficult to summon the same fire he had once felt. Age had caught up to him, and the harsh realities of prison life had taken a toll on his body. His health deteriorated as he dealt with the consequences of the years spent indulging in the luxuries and excesses that had once seemed so vital. Carlos had once been untouchable, but in this cold, confined space, he was nothing more than another criminal, another inmate to be forgotten. But even as his physical condition worsened, Carlos's mind remained sharp. His reputation had, for a time, kept him isolated from the worst of prison life. There were still those who remembered the legacy of Carlos Reyes, even within the prison walls. It wasn't just fear that kept some at bay. It was respect, or at least an understanding of his former power. In a place where many inmates lived in fear, Carlos had somehow managed to maintain his aura of dominance, even if it was a mere shadow of what it once had been. Carlos's reflections on his empire were often bittersweet. His thoughts would drift to the men and women who had helped him build his network, those who had once pledged their loyalty to him. Many of them had met violent ends, or had been caught in the crossfire of the never-ending wars between cartels. Yet, some had managed to escape the law, slipping back into the shadows to rebuild or reorganize in a different form. Carlos couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for them. They were survivors, just as he had been, and they would always carry a piece of his legacy. And then there were the betrayals. Carlos spent countless hours replaying the faces of those who had turned on him, El Lobo chief among them. Betrayal had cost him everything, his cartel, his wealth, and ultimately his freedom. But he couldn't bring himself to hate El Lobo the way others would have expected. Instead, he admired him. El Lobo had done what Carlos himself might have done in his position. He had made a choice to save himself, to survive in a world where loyalty was often the first thing to be abandoned. In the quiet of his cell, Carlos sometimes wondered if his downfall had been inevitable. Had the weight of his empire simply grown too heavy for him to bear? Had the walls that he had built around his power been too high, too impenetrable? Perhaps, Carlos thought, his ambition had blinded him to the true cost of what he was doing. Power, once obtained, is never easily surrendered, and once lost, it's impossible to regain. Carlos had built his empire on violence and fear, and as he lay on his cot, weakened by illness and regret, he realized the cruel irony of it all. The very thing he had used to dominate and control had now become his prison, his isolation, his weakness. He had spent his life making enemies, but now those enemies were ghosts in his mind, and the real enemy was time. With each passing day, Carlos's health deteriorated. His body, once strong and full of vitality, had been worn down by years of hard living and the brutality of prison life. In his solitude, he had nothing but his memories to keep him company. Memories of the wealth he had once commanded, of the fear he had inspired, and of the empire he had built and lost. But there was also another memory, one that had become more vivid as the years passed. The faces of the innocent victims whose lives had been destroyed by his cartel. The women and children trafficked across borders, the families torn apart by violence, and the countless lives ruined by the drugs that had flowed from his empire. Carlos, for the first time, began to understand the weight of what he had done. The realization came slowly, creeping into his thoughts like a fog. The empire he had built was no longer something he could take pride in. It was a legacy of destruction, a reminder of how unchecked ambition could ruin everything it touched. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Carlos's condition worsened. He could feel the end approaching, and there was no longer any hope of escaping his fate. His name, once a symbol of power, had become synonymous with downfall. He had been brought to justice, but justice, as it turned out, was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning of a long period of reflection and regret. And so, as the final chapter of Carlos Reyes's life played out in the confines of his prison cell, one thing was certain: he would be remembered, not for the power he had wielded, nor for the empire he had built, but for the fall that had shattered it all. The story of Carlos Reyes was a warning, a tale of ambition gone too far, of a man who had everything but lost it all in the end. The days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, but Carlos's condition never seemed to improve. His health continued to deteriorate, each breath becoming a struggle. The doctors who visited him in his prison cell had confirmed what Carlos had known deep down. His time was running out. But despite the pain, despite the isolation, Carlos held on, if only because he had always prided himself on his resilience. He had built his empire from nothing, and if his body was now failing him, he would fight until the very end. Yet, there was something different about this final battle. It wasn't a battle for power, for control, or for survival. It was a battle with the haunting realization that everything he had worked for, his wealth, his cartel, the empire he had so carefully crafted, had led him to this moment. An old man lying in a prison cell with nothing but time to reflect on his mistakes. Carlos had been the master of manipulation, always able to bend others to his will. But now, as he lay in his cell, there was no one left to manipulate. No cartel to command, no resources to leverage. His wealth had been seized, his network broken apart, and even his own health had betrayed him. The world that had once bowed to his every whim was gone, replaced by the cold, unforgiving reality of prison life. Still, Carlos's mind remained sharp. He had learned to adapt, to keep moving even when he was cornered. But now there was no way out. Every door had been closed. The law had caught up with him, and despite his best efforts to avoid it, he was facing the consequences of a lifetime spent in the shadows. His legacy, once a symbol of unbridled power, was now a cautionary tale, a story of what happens when one man's ambition outweighs his humanity. The weight of the lives he had destroyed pressed down on him like a heavy cloak, one that he could never shed. He had built an empire on drugs, violence, and manipulation, and in doing so, he had created a system that was destined to collapse under its own weight. And yet, Carlos still found himself grappling with a final question. Was it all worth it? Had the power, the wealth, the control been worth the destruction it left in its wake? The answer, now painfully clear to him, was no. His empire, his legacy, had been built on the suffering of countless others, and it had all come crashing down. In his final days, Carlos wasn't surrounded by loyal henchmen or powerful allies. He wasn't plotting his next move or contemplating ways to escape his fate. Instead, he was alone, alone with his thoughts, alone with the truth of his actions. He had been a man who had once thought himself invincible, but now he was nothing more than another prisoner, his life a fleeting shadow of the man he had been. Carlos's mind began to wander to the faces of the people he had betrayed, the families torn apart by his actions, the lives lost in his pursuit of power. He thought of the young men and women who had worked for him, many of whom had been either killed or arrested. He thought of the countless innocents who had been caught in the crossfire, those whose lives had been ruined by the drugs that flowed from his empire. For the first time in years, Carlos found himself reflecting on the people he had hurt. He had always justified his actions with the belief that survival in the criminal world required ruthlessness. But now, in the quiet of his cell, with the weight of his past bearing down on him, he began to see it differently. He had built an empire on the backs of the weak, using fear and violence to maintain control. But now the empire was gone, and all he had left was regret. Despite his deteriorating health, Carlos clung to one final hope, that in his final days he could find a sense of peace. He had spent his life fighting, struggling to maintain control, to protect his empire, to outsmart his enemies. But now, in the silence of his cell, he realized that there was nothing left to fight for. The only battle left was with himself. As the days passed and Carlos's condition worsened, he found himself thinking about the legacy he would leave behind. Would he be remembered as a ruthless drug lord, a kingpin who had ruled with an iron fist? Or would he be remembered as a cautionary tale, a man whose greed and ambition ultimately led to his undoing? The finality of it all began to set in. The system he had created, the empire he had built, had all been swept away in the blink of an eye. His name, once whispered in fear, would soon be forgotten. His story, once a legend, would fade into the annals of criminal history, a tale of ambition gone too far. But as Carlos lay there, alone and fading, he couldn't help but wonder, would anyone ever learn from his mistakes? Would the next generation of criminals fall into the same trap he had? He had been driven by power, by the desire to control, to dominate. And in the end, that very desire had led to his destruction. Carlos Reyes had once been a king, but now, in the twilight of his life, he was nothing more than a man paying the price for his choices. The empire was gone, and so too was the power he had so desperately clung to. His story, like so many before him, was one of rise and fall, a reminder that no matter how high you climb, the fall is always waiting. Carlos Reyes's final days in prison were marked by a strange stillness. The once vibrant, calculating mind that had built and controlled an empire was now confined to a body slowly failing him. His prison cell, once a symbol of captivity and punishment, became the only space where he had no power. The walls, cold and indifferent, offered him no solace, no escape from the inevitable. As the days grew longer, Carlos's health continued to decline. He was plagued by constant physical pain, the result of years of abuse, both from the life he had lived and the unforgiving conditions of his imprisonment. The doctors who came to see him did their best, but there was only so much they could do for someone in his condition. His strength had diminished, his body frail, his mind often clouded by the weight of his past. It was during these final days that Carlos found himself haunted by his thoughts. His dreams, too, had become plagued by memories of his empire, of the people he had manipulated, and of the lives he had destroyed. Faces of his former lieutenants, those who had once sworn their loyalty to him, appeared before him in his sleep, their expressions grim and unforgiving. He was no longer the man who commanded fear and respect. He was just another criminal, his legacy tarnished beyond repair. Carlos had once reveled in the power he held over people. His empire was vast, his influence immeasurable. Now he was left with nothing but time to reflect on what he had lost. He had always believed that his empire was built on solid ground, that his control over the criminal world would last forever. But as the walls of his cell closed in around him, he realized how fragile that power had truly been. The most haunting thought that lingered in Carlos's mind, though, was the idea that he had never truly understood the cost of what he had done. He had built his empire with the blood of his enemies and the loyalty of those who feared him. But at what cost? He had sacrificed so much, his humanity, his morality, his very soul, all in the name of power. And now, as the end drew near, he couldn't escape the realization that it had never been worth it. It wasn't just the lives he had taken, the families he had ruined, or the violence he had caused that tormented him. It was the realization that his empire, which he had built with such care and calculation, had been fragile from the start. It had been constructed on lies, betrayal, and fear. Carlos had known this deep down, but he had refused to acknowledge it, allowing himself to believe that he was untouchable. In his final months, as the end of his life loomed closer, Carlos began to lose himself in memories of his rise to power. He remembered the first time he held a gun, the first time he made a deal that changed the course of his life. He remembered the thrill of watching his enemies fall, the satisfaction of knowing he had outsmarted them. And yet, in those memories, there was no joy anymore, only emptiness. He began to wonder if, perhaps, there had been another way. What if he had chosen a different path? What if he had never embraced the world of crime? What if he had chosen to build something meaningful, something that would have lasted beyond his own life? These thoughts were fleeting, but they brought with them a sense of sadness that he couldn't escape. The realization that his empire was nothing but a fleeting moment in history, a tragic chapter in the larger story of life, was a bitter one. Carlos's time in prison had allowed him a rare gift: perspective. From his cell, he had watched the world change, and he had realized how much he had been left behind. His empire, once a symbol of his brilliance and ambition, had crumbled. The criminal world had evolved, and Carlos had been left in the past, unable to keep up with the new generation of criminals who had learned from his mistakes. He was no longer the powerful figure he had once been. He was just another man in a cell, waiting for the inevitable. But even as Carlos's health deteriorated, his name continued to hold weight in certain circles. The young criminals who had taken up the mantle of the cartels still spoke of him, some with reverence, others with fear. His legacy, though tainted, still carried influence. But the truth was clear to Carlos now. His legacy wasn't something to be proud of. It was a warning. In his final days, Carlos spent long hours contemplating his life. He thought about the choices he had made, the people he had betrayed, and the empire he had built. The reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. His wealth, his power, his empire, all of it had come to nothing. And now, in the cold silence of his prison cell, he could only await the inevitable end. It wasn't just the physical pain that Carlos felt. It was the emotional weight of his choices, the realization that he had destroyed everything he had once held dear. His reign had come to an end, not with a dramatic explosion or a violent confrontation, but with a slow, inevitable decline. And as he faced that final moment, there was no one left to mourn him, no legacy left to carry on. Carlos Reyes had been a force to be reckoned with, but in the end, he was just another criminal whose life had ended in ruin. Carlos Reyes's final days became a quiet, painful countdown to the inevitable. In the isolation of his cell, surrounded by nothing but the echoes of his past and the distant hum of the prison, he came to accept his fate. The memories of his empire, of the vast wealth, the power he had once commanded, and the fear he had instilled, felt distant, like an unreachable dream. Now, in the twilight of his life, all that remained were the fragments of his former self, the broken pieces of a once mighty kingpin. His body, frail and worn from years of violence and excess, had begun to give up on him. But it was his mind that still fought back, still clinging to the remnants of the empire that had once been his. Carlos could feel the cold, familiar grip of mortality tightening around him, but he refused to let go of the last shred of dignity he had left. He wasn't going to die as just another prisoner, forgotten and insignificant. He had once been untouchable, and though he no longer held the reins of power, he still carried the weight of his reputation. Carlos thought about his past, about the decisions that had led him to this point. He had come from nothing, born into poverty, raised in a world that offered few opportunities for escape. His rise had been swift, his ambition unmatched. But with every step forward, he had left a trail of destruction behind him. Enemies, allies, and innocents alike had fallen by the wayside. He had been driven by a need to control, to dominate, to carve his name into the world. But now, as he lay in his prison cell, Carlos realized the true cost of his ambition. The walls of his cell, once a symbol of captivity, now felt strangely comforting. The endless days of confinement had allowed him time to reflect, to consider the consequences of his actions. Carlos Reyes had built his empire on fear, on blood, and on violence. But it was his own hubris that had brought him down. In the end, the thing that had made him so powerful, the very quality that had allowed him to climb to the top, had also been his greatest flaw. His inability to trust, his thirst for more, and his obsession with control had led him to betray those closest to him, to alienate those who could have saved him. The legacy of Carlos Reyes was a complex one. To some, he was a symbol of strength, a man who had carved his own path in a world that offered no mercy. To others, he was a villain, a criminal whose empire had caused untold suffering. And now, in the silence of his cell, Carlos had come to understand that the world would remember him for both. He would be remembered for the violence and destruction he had left in his wake, but also for the empire he had built, a testament to his ambition and his will to survive. As his health deteriorated further, Carlos found himself grappling with the reality that there was no escaping his past. The walls he had built around himself, both physically and emotionally, had crumbled. He was no longer the powerful figure who had ruled the criminal underworld. He was just a man, a prisoner, awaiting the inevitable. His legacy was sealed, but it was not the one he had once dreamed of. Carlos's story was one of rise and fall, of ambition and betrayal, of power gained and lost. It was a story that would be told for years to come, passed down through the annals of criminal history. His name would always be remembered, perhaps not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale, a warning of what can happen when power is unchecked, when ambition overrides morality, and when loyalty is betrayed. And as Carlos lay there, fading away in the prison he had come to call home, he could not help but wonder if there had ever been another way. If, instead of building an empire on violence and fear, he could have built something else, something that would have lasted. The thought of what might have been lingered in his mind, but it was too late now. His empire was gone, and there was no turning back. Carlos Reyes, once a king, now a broken man, spent his final days contemplating the choices he had made and the life he had lived. His story would be remembered, but it would be remembered as a warning, a story of ambition and its inevitable consequences. The prison cell, once a place of confinement, became the final stage of Carlos's life. In the end, there were no grand gestures, no dramatic showdowns. There was only the quiet, inevitable decline of a man who had once thought himself invincible. As the years slipped away, the world moved on without him. New cartels rose, new leaders emerged, but the shadow of Carlos Reyes remained. And when Carlos passed away, his name went down in history, not as the king of the underworld, but as a symbol of how ambition, unchecked by morality, can lead to ruin. He had been brought to justice, but in the end, it was not the law that defeated him. It was time, the one thing even the most powerful man could not control. Carlos Reyes died alone in his cell, his empire a distant memory. His story, once filled with power and fear, had come to an end, a somber reminder of what happens when the thirst for power consumes everything around it. Carlos Reyes's death, while not unexpected, sent ripples through the criminal world. He had been a name spoken in hushed tones, a figure who had once commanded not just a cartel, but an empire built on violence, fear, and wealth. His final days in prison, isolated from the world that had once bowed to him, marked the end of an era. But even in death, Carlos's legacy would continue to affect the world in ways he had never imagined. As news of his death spread, the reactions were mixed. For some, Carlos's passing was a cause for celebration, a symbol of the end of a criminal regime that had caused untold suffering. Law enforcement agencies across the world, from Mexico to the United States, saw it as the conclusion of a chapter in their long pursuit of the man who had been one of the most elusive and dangerous criminals in history. For others, Carlos's death was a reminder of the power he had once wielded, a lingering symbol of a world in which corruption and violence often prevailed over justice. In the prison where Carlos spent his final years, his death was met with a sense of quiet indifference. The guards, who had long grown accustomed to the sight of powerful men stripped of their glory, saw his passing as just another chapter in the cycle of crime and punishment. But for the inmates who had once whispered of his name with both fear and reverence, Carlos's death marked the end of a legend. His story, for better or worse, had shaped the prison's very culture. But the true consequences of Carlos's death were felt outside the prison walls. The empire he had once controlled was now in disarray. Rival cartels, sensing the power vacuum left in his wake, began to fight for control of the territories Carlos had once ruled. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the war for power would once again spiral into chaos. But the truth was that Carlos's cartel, much like its leader, had been weakened by years of infighting, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of law enforcement. The men who had once served under him were now scattered, each trying to carve out their own piece of the empire that had once been the envy of the criminal world. Still, some of Carlos's most loyal lieutenants, Those who had managed to escape the law began to regroup. They knew that the cartel's influence could not be completely erased, not as long as there were still remnants of it left in the world. And so, in the shadows of the criminal world, whispers began to emerge. Carlos's death was only the beginning of a new chapter, one in which his former allies would either rise to power or fall to the same fate as their former leader. But for those who had known Carlos, those who had worked with him, his death was more than just the end of a cartel boss. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of power, the unpredictability of ambition, and the harsh reality of a life lived in pursuit of wealth and control. Many who had once stood by Carlos's side now found themselves questioning the choices they had made, the alliances they had formed, and the lives they had taken in the name of power. In the aftermath of Carlos's death, a small group of former allies attempted to rebuild what had been lost. They knew it would take years to regain the influence they had once had, but they were determined to try. The lessons of Carlos Reyes were not easily forgotten. The man who had once ruled the underworld with an iron fist had left behind a blueprint for power, for survival, and for the ruthlessness required to maintain control. But his downfall had also served as a cautionary tale, a warning for those who would dare to follow in his footsteps. As the years passed, Carlos's legacy continued to live on in the criminal world. His name became synonymous with the rise and fall of empires. Empires built on the suffering of others, empires that crumbled as quickly as they were constructed. His story was passed down from one generation of criminals to the next, a tale of ambition and betrayal, of power and corruption, of a man who had reached the top and lost it all. And yet, Carlos's story was also a reminder that power, in the end, is always fleeting. No matter how carefully one builds an empire, no matter how much blood and sweat goes into its creation, it is never impervious to the forces that seek to tear it down. The world had watched as Carlos Reyes had risen, flourished, and fallen. And now, as his death faded into history, the world moved on. But the echoes of his life, of his empire, remained proof of the destructive power of unchecked ambition. Carlos Reyes may have died in a prison cell, but his name would never be fully forgotten. His story would live on in the shadows, in the quiet corners of the criminal world, as a warning to those who sought to follow in his footsteps. The empire he had built, though destroyed, would always be remembered. And as for Carlos, the man who had once held the world in his grip, he had become nothing more than a name, a story, a cautionary tale. His legacy was one of tragedy, but it was a tragedy that would continue to shape the world long after his death. As Carlos Reyes's name faded from the public eye, his story became a legend, one that was passed down in whispered conversations, from the cold halls of law enforcement to the dimly lit rooms of the criminal underworld. Those who had once admired him, feared him, or worked for him, now spoke of him with a mixture of respect and disdain. His empire, though fractured, left behind a significant mark on the world. While law enforcement agencies across the globe celebrated his fall, there were still those who felt a lingering sense of loss, whether it was for the power he had commanded or for the certainty that in his wake, chaos had followed. For many of his former allies, Carlos had been more than just a leader. He had been a father figure, a protector, someone who had given them everything they had. Yet, as time passed, they realized the cost of that loyalty. Most of them now scattered to the wind, hunted or hiding, knowing that Carlos's downfall had marked the beginning of a violent, unpredictable new world. But not all of Carlos's former cartel members were so easily crushed. A handful of his most trusted lieutenants, having escaped the law's grasp, began to regroup. They knew that the cartel's old structure had crumbled, But they also knew that a new power vacuum had opened up, one that they could fill. It was no longer about replicating what Carlos had built. It was about taking the lessons of the past, learning from them, and forging something new, something that could survive the changing tides of the criminal underworld. The world was different now. Law enforcement had evolved, too, in ways that Carlos never could have anticipated. Digital surveillance, international cooperation, and new intelligence networks made it harder for any criminal empire to operate with the same freedom that Carlos once had. But his former lieutenants weren't foolish. They had learned from his mistakes. They understood the importance of keeping things under the radar, of building alliances that could outlast even the most intense law enforcement pressure. In the shadows, these men and women, some of whom had been with Carlos from the very beginning, began to create a new cartel, one that would be built on the lessons learned from their former leaders' rise and fall. They knew that the world Carlos had known was gone, but they were willing to play the long game. The game of survival, of adaptability, and of patience. In time, they would rise again, but they would do it quietly in the background, operating with a level of caution that Carlos had never quite managed to master. Outside the world of crime, Carlos's story had become a symbol, a warning to those who sought to emulate him. His rise from nothing to ruling an empire was a story that inspired many, but it also carried a heavy lesson. No empire, no matter how powerful, was invincible. Carlos had underestimated the fragility of the system he built, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. His story became a blueprint for both criminal and legal minds alike. For law enforcement, it was a cautionary tale of how unchecked power could corrupt and lead to catastrophic consequences. For those in the underworld who still yearned for power, it was a reminder that ambition, if not tempered with wisdom, could lead to destruction. For the authorities, the fall of Carlos was a triumph, a symbol of the slow, relentless pursuit of justice. His arrest, his trial, and his eventual death had become an emblem of the law's ability to catch even the most elusive criminals. But for the public, for those who had witnessed his rise and fall, Carlos Reyes's name was synonymous with the dual nature of power, the allure of ambition and the consequences of overreach. As the years passed, the public's interest in Carlos waned, replaced by new criminal figures, new faces who were ready to rise. But his legacy lingered in the shadows. He was still talked about in the dark corners of the world where power and violence ruled, a name that would never be fully erased from the criminal world. But even as the world moved on, Carlos's family, if they could still be called that, had to live with the repercussions of his actions. Many of those who had once worked for him had now become shadows themselves, living in fear that they would meet the same fate as their former leader. His family, which had been scattered across the country, continued to live under the shadow of his name, some of them still in hiding, others trying to rebuild their lives in the wake of his empire's destruction. And for Carlos's final moments, as the world moved on and his name became just another part of history's dark tapestry, he had no audience. There would be no grand gestures in his death. No one would write his name in the history books as a powerful figure. He had once been a king, but in the end, he had been reduced to a name, a memory. His empire had faded, and his influence had been eroded by time and betrayal. Yet, Carlos's story still lingered. His name would never truly disappear, not in the places where the echoes of his reign still haunted the dark corners of society. In the minds of those who sought to follow in his footsteps, his rise and fall would continue to be studied, analyzed, and remembered as the story of a man who had everything and lost it all. And in the silence of his prison cell, Carlos would never truly be at peace. His empire, his legacy, had been built on blood. And in the end, it was blood, his own, that sealed his fate. Carlos Reyes's name continued to echo through the criminal world, a shadow cast over those who sought to rise to the heights he had once reached. Yet, in the final years of his life, Carlos's understanding of his own legacy had grown clearer. He had built an empire with sheer ambition, ruthless violence, and the ability to manipulate others. But in the end, all those things could not protect him from time, from the betrayal of those closest to him, and from the relentless pursuit of justice. Carlos's empire was now a distant memory, a cautionary tale shared among the criminal and law enforcement communities. Despite his death, there was still an undercurrent of admiration for the scale of what he had achieved. He had not simply been a drug lord. He had been a symbol of power, of control. And the remnants of that symbol remained, even if only in whispers. The new faces that emerged in the wake of Carlos's fall were not as bold, not as charismatic. They had learned from his mistakes. They saw the consequences of Carlos's ambition, and they knew that a quieter, more calculated approach might be the key to surviving in the dangerous world he had left behind. But despite their attempts to avoid the same pitfalls, the shadow of Carlos's legacy loomed large over them. His story was one of both fear and admiration, a reminder of what was possible, and what was possible to lose. Even those who had once been Carlos's allies found themselves dealing with the aftermath of his reign. Some of his former partners in crime were left with nothing, their connections either severed or destroyed by law enforcement. Those who had managed to escape the law were now older, wiser, and far more cautious. They knew that the world Carlos had navigated so effortlessly was now much different. Law enforcement had adapted, and the criminal world had splintered into even smaller, more fragmented factions. The power Carlos had once held had been decentralized, and in many ways, that made it harder for anyone to regain the level of influence he had commanded. Still, the story of Carlos Reyes was one that could not be easily erased. His downfall had shaken the very foundation of Mexico's criminal underworld, and it had forced a reckoning in the way that cartels operated. His empire had been one of great scale, but it had also been fragile. It had been based on loyalty, fear, and violence, but not on sustainability. The more Carlos expanded, the more he stretched himself thin, leaving cracks that would eventually lead to his downfall. His loyalty had always been conditional, and it had come back to haunt him when El Lobo and others turned against him. For law enforcement, Carlos's fall was the culmination of years of work, of intelligence gathering, and of international cooperation. The world had watched as the authorities had pursued him relentlessly, closing in until the cartel boss was finally taken down. His capture, his trial, and his eventual death had been a massive victory for those who had spent years working to dismantle his criminal operations. But even in death, Carlos remained an enigma. His motives, his rise to power, and his fall were questions that remained unanswered, at least to those who didn't know the intricacies of his life. The investigation into his empire continued long after his death. The authorities worked tirelessly to piece together the full extent of his operations, tracing the money, the drugs, and the violence back to their sources. They uncovered even more about the political connections Carlos had made, the businesses he had infiltrated, and the vast network of corruption that had allowed him to thrive for so long. But the more they discovered, the more they realized how deep Carlos's influence had run, and how long it would take to undo the damage he had caused. In the years following his death, some of Carlos's surviving allies attempted to revive his empire, but they quickly learned that such a feat was nearly impossible. The cartel had been crippled by law enforcement, and the cracks in the organization had widened in Carlos's absence. Those who tried to take his place found themselves dealing with infighting, power struggles, and constant pressure from the authorities. Even with the remnants of Carlos's old network, it was clear that no one would ever be able to replicate the scale of his empire. Carlos Reyes had created a legacy of fear, and in many ways, it was a legacy that continued to influence the criminal world. But his story had also become a warning, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the fragility of power, and of the price of betrayal. He had once been a king in the criminal underworld, but in the end, his empire had fallen, and he had been left with nothing but his memories and regrets. For those who had been closest to him, the loss of Carlos Reyes was a bitter pill to swallow. They had seen firsthand how his ambition had shaped their lives, for better or worse. And now, with his death, they found themselves at a crossroads. Some chose to fade into the background, while others tried to build something new from the ashes of the empire that had once been theirs to command. But the story of Carlos Reyes would never be fully forgotten. His name would live on in the history of Mexico's criminal landscape as one of the most powerful and ruthless figures to ever exist. And for generations to come, his rise and fall would serve as a lesson, a warning to those who sought to follow in his footsteps, to those who still believed that power, wealth, and control could be built on a foundation of fear and violence. Carlos Reyes had built an empire, but in the end, it was an empire that couldn't last. His story was one of both triumph and tragedy, of ambition and downfall, of power gained and lost. And though his name would eventually fade from the headlines, the lessons of his life and his empire would continue to shape the world long after his death. Carlos Reyes's death marked the final chapter of a man who had once been a figure of legendary power, but it also signaled a shift in the criminal landscape. The world had been forced to reckon with the magnitude of his influence, and in the years following his passing, those who had once been part of his empire had to adapt. The criminal underworld, once dominated by his cartel, was now a fractured and chaotic space. But while Carlos's physical presence was gone, the scars of his reign remained. For the survivors of his empire, those who had once pledged their loyalty to him, life had become a constant balancing act. Some tried to stay hidden, quietly fading into the background, while others sought to rebuild in a new world that was more aware of the dangers of unchecked power. The legacy of Carlos Reyes was not something easily erased, and it was the very lessons of his rise and fall that continued to shape the next generation of criminals. In the years after his death, Carlos's name remained whispered among those who had been involved in the business, the ones who knew the brutality of the man and the power that he had once wielded. Some saw his story as a tragic one, a man who had climbed too high and too fast, only to be brought down by his own ambition. Others remembered him as a symbol of strength, someone who had defied the odds and made his mark on the world. But for law enforcement, the job wasn't finished. Though Carlos was dead, the network he had built had left behind a shadow, a collection of smaller cartels, some of which had once been rivals to his empire, now vying for control of the territories he had once dominated. The world Carlos had left behind was still in turmoil. His death had opened the door to a new era of violence, as new leaders sought to seize power. The global push to dismantle the remnants of Carlos's cartel was relentless, and slowly, one by one, his allies were captured, some arrested, others eliminated. The task force that had spent years chasing him now focused on eradicating the remains of his influence. The cartel's finances were frozen, its assets seized, and its members hunted down or scattered to the four corners of the globe. Yet, despite these efforts, the real question was not whether the cartel would ever return to its former glory, but how the lessons of Carlos's empire would continue to shape the future. His influence was still felt, not just through the criminals who had been part of his inner circle, but through the way he had shaped the drug trade, smuggling operations, and the art of building power. In prison, Carlos had once mused on the consequences of his life. Now, in the aftermath of his death, the world was left to confront those consequences. The vacuum left by Carlos's fall had not been easily filled. In fact, it had proven to be even more unstable than the empire he had built. What had once been a structured organization, ruled by fear and loyalty, was now a chaotic network of smaller factions, each vying for dominance. Carlos's once clear vision of power was replaced by confusion, violence, and constant infighting. For the public, Carlos's death had been a moment of closure. It had been the end of a long battle, and there was some relief in knowing that one of the most dangerous criminals in history had been brought to justice. But for those who had lived in the shadows of his empire, the story wasn't over. The impact of Carlos Reyes was still being felt, whether in the violence that continued to spread across the border, the political corruption he had left in his wake, or the families who had been torn apart by the drugs that flowed through his cartel. In the criminal world, Carlos's death had left a significant legacy. His story had become a symbol of what could happen when one man's ambition went unchecked, but it had also become a rallying cry for others who sought to follow in his footsteps. New criminal figures had emerged, some with the same ruthlessness and cunning that Carlos had once used to climb to the top. They studied his rise, his methods, and his ultimate demise. They learned from his mistakes, vowing to avoid the same pitfalls that had led to his downfall. They knew that in the world Carlos had once ruled, it was not enough to simply survive. It was about adapting to the changing tides and staying ahead of the law. Carlos's death, though it marked the end of an era, was not the end of the story. His influence was still felt in the way the world responded to crime, to corruption, and to the power dynamics that governed society. His story, though tragic, had become part of the fabric of history, a story of a man who had built something extraordinary, only to watch it collapse in the end. And in the quiet corners of Mexico's criminal underworld, as the new wave of leaders rose, the echoes of Carlos's name would continue to haunt them. His legacy, twisted as it was, would serve as both a warning and an inspiration. For in the world of power, there was no guarantee of stability, no assurance that those who built empires would live to see them last. Carlos had learned that lesson the hard way. But as his story was passed from one generation of criminals to the next, it became clear. The cycle of power and destruction would continue, with new kings rising to take the place of those who had fallen. Carlos Reyes had always known that empires don't last forever. Yet, in the end, it was his own empire's rapid disintegration that seemed to echo louder than anything he had ever accomplished. As the dust settled, the world slowly moved on from the storm he had caused, but the ripple effects of his empire's fall continued to reverberate, especially in the places where he had once ruled. In Mexico, new cartels began to emerge, more fragmented than Carlos's once imposing empire, but no less violent or dangerous. They were smaller, more agile, and often more brutal, knowing full well that law enforcement was closing in on them. Unlike Carlos, who had carefully built relationships with powerful figures to maintain control, these new players in the underworld understood the importance of secrecy, of staying under the radar. They knew that being too visible would lead to their downfall, much like it had for Carlos. The power vacuum he left behind wasn't simply filled. It was fractured into 1,000 pieces, each being fought over by those who had once been his lieutenants, rival cartels, and opportunistic gang leaders. And while they fought to control territory and influence, the violence escalated. The drug trade continued to flow, but in an increasingly volatile environment where trust was hard to come by and loyalty even harder to find. Carlos's former partners, if they were still alive or at large, were now seeking refuge, often hiding out in countries where the long arm of law enforcement hadn't yet reached. For the families and victims of Carlos's empire, however, the aftermath of his reign was far from over. While the criminal world had swiftly adapted, many of the communities that had suffered under Carlos's rule were left to pick up the pieces. Entire regions had been devastated by the violence he had unleashed, and though Carlos was gone, his influence still lingered in the lives of those who had lost family members to the drug trade, the violence, and the corruption that his cartel had perpetuated. And yet, in the deeper recesses of Mexico's criminal landscape, there were still whispers of Carlos's name. His story had become a part of the culture of the underworld, passed on through the generations as both a warning and a myth. He had been a man of vision, of daring, and of ambition who had once controlled the underworld. For some, his fall was a tragedy, a story of what happens when one becomes too ambitious, too ruthless, and too blind to the betrayals around them. For others, he was a martyr, an example of how powerful men are never allowed to live forever. They're eventually replaced, and their empires are overtaken by those who are willing to play the game with a bit more subtlety. In his final years, Carlos had reflected on the very nature of his existence. His obsession with power had driven him to conquer everything in his path. But at what cost? His mind was full of what-ifs, questions he would never get the chance to answer. What if he had trusted people more? What if he had known when to step away? Would things have turned out differently? And yet, as his life drew to a close, Carlos had come to terms with the fact that it was too late for such reflections. He had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. After his death, the world moved on. Cartels and gangs continued their deadly work, and Mexico's war on drugs raged on. But Carlos's story, the rise and fall of one of the most powerful criminal figures in history, would be passed down through generations. His name, though forever linked to violence, greed, and betrayal, also became synonymous with the price of unchecked ambition. Though his death marked the end of his physical reign, it signified a more symbolic end. Carlos had been a master at creating a system of control through fear, but his death revealed the ultimate truth of his empire. It had always been fragile, built on foundations that could crumble the moment his influence was lost. The destruction of Carlos's empire was not just the fall of a man. It was the fall of the idea that power could be maintained without consequence. In the years to follow, those who came after Carlos, those who had once dreamed of following in his footsteps, would come to see the holes in the world he had built. The criminals who rose after him learned from his mistakes, careful, cautious, and reluctant to trust anyone. Some of Carlos's old allies, now scattered or in hiding, would attempt to find ways to rebuild, but they had learned that the old ways of power, of violence, control, and fear, no longer worked in the same way. The criminal landscape had evolved, and Carlos's old methods were no longer viable in a world that had moved on. For those who had once worked with Carlos, his death brought both an end and a strange kind of peace. It was a painful peace, the recognition that their former leader had been taken down, that the empire they had once worked for no longer existed. But in some ways, his death also freed them. Free from the constant paranoia, free from the pressures of upholding an empire built on blood and treachery. And so, as the years passed, Carlos's name continued to be remembered, not as the king he had once been, but as a cautionary tale, a symbol of the dangers of unbridled ambition, and a man who had risen to the top only to be brought down by the very forces he had once controlled. His story remained one of tragedy, but also a warning that the higher you climb, the further you fall. The fall of Carlos Reyes had marked the end of one era, but it was the beginning of another, one that would be shaped by the lessons of his rise and fall. His legacy, for better or worse, would live on,